Okay, so yes, my name is Matt White. I'm the Director of Clinical Research Informatics in the UAB Informatics Institute, the CCTS, and the Health Systems Enterprise Data Warehouse team. So I do wear quite a number of hats. There you go. So informatics is a pretty broad domain, and there's a lot of it that I won't talk about in general. But just for general background, there are a great number of functional domains related to informatics and organizations that are really overlapping in a pretty significant way. The CCTS, the Informatics Institute, the Enterprise Data Warehouse team, specifically a research team in the Health Systems Enterprise Data Warehouse team, which I manage. And so there are a lot of faculty in informatics who do lots of different sort of things. We do a lot of software development. There are faculty who do natural language processing and text mining, machine learning, predictive modeling, integration of clinical systems, innovation in EHR development, ontology development, and that's the clinical-oriented side of the house. There's a whole bioinformatics, computational biology, omics side of the house that there are faculty, quite a number of faculty and trainees who work in that space. That's not my particular domain. And then there's a lot of integrative work where we seek to bring genomic approaches and interests and clinical phenomic approaches and interests together for the learning health system, for population health, for personalized and precision medicine, etc. So all that said, most of that I'm not going to talk about very much today, but by all means, come see me if that's your area of interest. The primary topic for today is clinical data, and I can boil this down to probably 10 seconds worth of a pitch. There's lots of data in the electronic health record. You could probably use it. I'm sure you would find it valuable. You should be using it, and come to me and I will help you use it. So there's data there. Don't go without. And there are lots of opportunities to make effective use of the data in our extremely large, robust electronic health record in our large academic medical center to support your research. So I think this question is probably a little less relevant today because I think most of the folks here are sort of clinically oriented. At least I see a good proportion of people wearing scrubs. So I sometimes ask who is actually interested in clinical data, in patient data, as opposed to animal models and bench science, and who actually uses the electronic health record. Okay, lots of hands, nice. So do you use the health record data for your research currently? A couple nods, a couple hands. Okay, and so keep this in mind as I'm talking. If I don't talk about how you want to use the data, by all means, I would like to know how you want to use the data that we're not already providing. So there are a couple of models of access, and one is self-service, and one is honest broker mediated. So we serve both as a software development entity that we build tools to let you get to data yourself. If at all possible, if within policy at UAB. And there's a great deal that you can do within policy by yourself, all day, every day, anybody with a Blazer ID, anytime you want, even if your grant's due in 12 hours and it's midnight. And then there's the honest broker mediated function. So if you want to get actual full patient information for an IRB-approved protocol, or if you want information that is for any reason not sort of in the self-service delivery model, we have a whole group of enterprise data warehouse analysts that are specifically here for supporting the research efforts at UAB, and come to us and we can help you with data, whether that is preparatory to research, whether that is detailed clinical data, finding something in the EHR, free text, getting access to free text data, anything you want. So I'll talk in general terms about two things. One is the enterprise data warehouse. Big picture is effectively all the data at UAB. And then I2B2, which is a self-service tool that you can log into yourself and access some portions of that data. So there are a couple of models represented in the circles. The way that it has always been done at UAB, unless somebody was just manually abstracting data themselves by looking at the chart, is by having enterprise data warehouse analyst mediated access to the EHR via the data warehouse. That is, the researcher wants data, you come to an analyst, they go get it for you and give it to you. That's always been the case. It has often not been staffed very heavily, and people have had to stand in line behind people who are interested in clinical operations, quality, patient safety, etc. That has changed now as of the last probably 3, 4, 5 years. We have a specific research supporting group. You no longer have to wait for all of the world's problems to be solved in clinical practice. We're a research group. We do the research data requests all day, every day. But we also have this other mechanism where you don't have to go through a analyst. You can directly access this data, which I think is ideal, because then you don't even have to come to us. It saves us time, saves you time, everybody's happy. There are a couple of other things on this slide that I'll talk about just a little bit. But there are pipelines for access to data outside UAB as well. So we're a part of 2 different organizations outside of UAB. One is the NCATS ACT network. So when I show you I2B2 and show you that we can ask questions about populations of patients within UAB, we can do the same thing across the ACT network and see that we have 150 patients here at UAB, but out of these other 40 institutions, here are 3 or 4 others who have a large population. Or if you happen to know somebody at one of those institutions, you know that their equivalent population. You can't necessarily do all of the things that we can do with our instance of I2B2 here. There's not nearly as much data shared across the network, so you can't ask all of the detailed questions. And you certainly can't download that data from other sites like you can from UAB. The other is Trinetics, which is more of a inbound opportunity pipeline. So people coming to UAB seeking investigators interested in studies because they can see our patient population and can identify a population of interest and come to us and say, we see that you have this number of people who meet our criteria for this study. Are you interested? We have probably maybe 5 to 10 a month like that coming into UAB. So when I say there's data available to support all parts of the research process, this is my list of all parts of the research process. If I'm missing part of the research process, please tell me, because I'd like to add it to the slide. So it can range anywhere from hypothesis exploration, just you have no idea what you want to study, go start running queries and try to figure out patterns, look at information for 2 or 3 different populations, really just explore. In the past, there have not been a policy acceptable way just to explore the electronic health record. That wasn't an appropriate activity within the context of clinical operations. I2B2 is not fully identified, so it is perfectly acceptable to go start running queries and try to figure out patterns of clinical data in practice. It is a underutilized function of this self-service tool. You can go explore all day long. The primary implementation of I2B2 in most places is for feasibility. It's, do we have a patient population that matches these characteristics? Age, race, gender, having a lab value within a certain range, a visit in the last 3 months, never had this diagnosis, had at least one of these diagnoses, is allergic to this, and whatever. Anything you want. The primary or the initial primary focus of I2B2 and its core function is how many patients do we have that have these characteristics. And the reason for that is because lots of program directors, department chairs, center director said that the way that people do that is, do we have enough patients for this study? Yeah, probably. And they completely guess. And we were notoriously bad at guessing. And guessing is not the right way to do that. And I2B2 provides you a really easy way, at least to do the first tier of identifying patients who meet particular criteria. After that, it goes to really whatever you want. You want to do secondary analysis, but you don't need to contact patients. You can download lots and lots of data from I2B2 by yourself. You can get all the diagnoses, all the meds, all the labs, just about anything else that we have in I2B2. You can download it today for a population of patients. It is automatically exempt from the IRB because they know that our system only provides information that is at the HIPAA limited data set level, so you can get dates and zip codes, but not full PHI. So you can download that today without ever having to go to the IRB. It is automatically exempt by virtue of you gaining access to I2B2 and hitting the button to download it. You can, when you're writing proposals, it's either for preliminary data, for supporting information, for characterizing your population of interest, characterizing two different populations of interest and highlighting the difference. So it doesn't necessarily have to be just aggregate information, or I've gotten my IRB approval and want to contact patients. You can use it to characterize 2 or 3 populations in your proposal development. I said external collaborators. If you want to find comparable people elsewhere, come see me. Identifying eligible patients and actually contacting those patients. It is a quite common thing to say, I have this population of 200 patients at UAB from I2B2. I would like to contact them for my research. Here's my IRB protocol. We'll give you all the contact information we have and their encounter information, including future encounters. You'll know where they're going to be sitting in a week. Or have all the contact information, and if the IRB says you can recruit from the clinical record, we can provide you all that information based on either a custom set of data and identification of patients that you want from the enterprise data warehouse, or from your I2B2 query. You read a query that found 100 patients, that's the 100 patients you get. Once you do research data collection, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't still take advantage of existing clinical data. So you do prospective data collection, you build your case report forms, collect the structured clinical data or the structured study data that you want, but there's also opportunities still to, one, not copy lab values from one place to another and put them in your research data set, but also get all of the clinical data for your population of patients that you've enrolled. So you have your study collected data, but you can also get encounter, diagnoses, labs, meds, any of that additional data to incorporate into your analysis. Okay, so talking about 2 basic things. One is the enterprise data warehouse, and one is I2B2. So the enterprise data warehouse is effectively anything in Cerner, Impact, anything in the electronic health record at UAB proper. We can incorporate, we have other data sources besides Cerner. It's the tumor registry, the transplant registry, really just about anything that is in structured data in a clinical system at UAB is sort of within the confines of the enterprise data warehouse, and we can provide that data for research. Text notes, so it is not uncommon that meaningful enriched data is in text at UAB. It is challenging to find patients based on the content of text. That's a whole domain of informatics research and work. Giving you the text for a set of patients is not challenging. We can, if you identify a set of 100 patients and say, I want these type notes, that's not challenging at all. Finding patients based on the content of those notes it's one, challenging, and two, an additional set of work that typically includes having a informatics faculty that does natural language processing as % effort on your grant, and I'm sure they would like that. The short answer, or the takeaway from that is, if it exists in clinical data, we can probably get it for you. it exists in structured data, that's great. We can get it for you probably pretty easily. Second is, what is I2B2? So I2B2 is a open source product that came out of Harvard Partners, Boston Children's, that is in use in hundreds and hundreds of institutions around the world. A lot of large academic medical centers, many of the top NIH-funded institutions, almost all of the CTSA organizations, of which UAB is one. It is commonly used as a research data warehouse. We use it sort of as such, but we don't limit it to that. It is, we see it more as a self-service tool than our warehouse. We already have a data warehouse. It's got lots more than I2B2 has in it. So we see it more as just a purpose-specific tool for you, not a data warehouse for us. It is most typically implemented as a cohort estimation tool in a completely de-identified way. We've done quite a bit more than that, and I'll describe that. And we can put any information we want into it. So anything you see here, we've decided to put into I2B2. We can put anything else you want. If there's a piece of information that you document in the clinic and you don't see it there, we can add it pretty easily, especially if it's structured data. Probably hear me talk about structured data. So anytime the folks who are actually using the clinical record have opportunity to impact that, if you can put it in structured data, it's a whole lot easier to get it out. So what's included in I2B2? From an organizational perspective, it's effectively anything it impacts. So UAB Hospital, TKC, Highlands, Women and Friends, any of the affiliated clinics, Acton Road, Hoover, Inverness, etc. It's not the iFoundation Hospital, Children's, Better, VA. It's not any of the affiliate organizations like in Huntsville and Montgomery, etc. And it's not our partner network. So it is not other legal entities. It is UAB at present. I've stopped trying to actually update these numbers. As you can kind of tell, this is probably about halfway through 2017. I've stopped trying to do the counts anymore because it's always out of date. We're always adding new data. You can see that there's a lot of information. There's lots of patients, there's lots of encounters, there's lots and lots of data. We're in the billions of pieces of clinical data in I2B2. The last count, there were 600,000 plus unique concepts in I2B2. So unique clinical observations, not instances of them, but different types. So hemoglobin A1C is one type of data, and we have 600,000 plus different fields or data elements in I2B2, not including the omic data. So some things that are not that are of interest that are really Cerner proper: the metric data, Encore, that's the tumor registry, Encore biospecimens, and the TCBF biospecimen data, census and geographic data. Encore case report form data is pending approval from the IRB to load that for AGHI. But that's an example of if we want to put additional data in, we can put additional data in. If that's study-derived data, then so be it.
So one of the challenges, I think, is people are seeking care at non-UAB institutions. It's invisible to us. So
absolutely.
Is there a possibility of breaking out, so like National Death Index, Medicare claims, things like that?
Possibility, yes. Typically, that is a very project-specific sort of thing. If we have access to data sets, certainly anything that includes that we can have a link to the medical record number, we can do. It would probably be, for the most part, a IRB governed activity and not really part of I2B2 and bringing that information into I2B2. But we've had projects where we have gotten information from elsewhere, and it is sometimes a mapping process, and it depends on how well that how closely that data is associated with UAB, and if there is an actual identifier that we can match to a medical record number. If there is, absolutely. It's usually a project-specific thing. UAB doesn't systemically interact with the National Death Index anymore. For project-specific things we have, so the death in I2B2 and the death in our EHR is largely focused on the people we know to have died because they died here. So what is in I2B2? It is anything we want, but here's the sort of the core content. It's things like diagnoses, labs, meds, microbiology test procedures, consult orders, biospecimens, allergies, some vital signs like pain scores, height, weight, BMI. We're in the process of that. We've actively gone out and asked for nursing input on what other vitals would be of value, and the things that we're currently loading are things like O2, various calculated scores, Braden, and various things like that, pulse, respiration, those sort of things. The surgical procedures, imaging orders. So we don't have imaging results, so it doesn't have doesn't have the content of that free text heavy radiology read note, but it does have the imaging order information. Social history information, so that has all the smoking, drug, household status, all that sort of stuff. And obviously patients and visits. We've recently added the census information, which allows you to identify patients based on characteristics of their census tract, not by their census tract, because census tract is PHI, because it's smaller than a zip code, but by the characteristic of their census tract. So if you do queries and say all of these clinical characteristics and live in a census tract with an average household income in this range, you'll get all of the people in any of the census tract that have that as the average household income.
Back to the vital signs. So there are some automatically calculated scores in the vitals here. So EWS and GSEP, are those pulled in that as well?
No, but they're incredibly easy to pull in. I would definitely say if there's anything that is documented as a clinical event on a flow sheet or any of these vitals are typically clinical events, we are already pulling hundreds and hundreds of clinical events. One more is incredibly easy to do. All you have to do is say, I would like this one, this one, this one, and this one, and I would like it in a folder that is titled this, and we can do that incredibly easily. We've done that for radiology. We've done it for rheumatology. We did it for neurosurgery. We've done it for various vitals for nursing. So the short answer is those don't sound familiar to me, so they're probably not in there. And we haven't brought in all of the clinical events. We've done it as people are identify the ones that they want. So come see me, and we can add anything you want. Especially clinical events, because they're really very easily structured. We're already pulling clinical events. It is really no additional work for us other than saying, add these to the list, and how do you want to see them in a structure, in an ontology, in a hierarchy within I2B2. That is sometimes really the only challenging part. So we say we want blood pressure. There are 90-something things that say blood pressure. We can pull the 90 things that say blood pressure really easily. We did. The more challenging part was, how do you organize it? Do you organize it by location? Do you organize it invasive versus non-invasive? Some things don't actually have a diastolic and systolic blood pressure. They say things like high blood pressure or some other qualitative value. But the challenge there wasn't pulling the blood pressures. It was, which one of these 90 things are really blood pressures, and how do you want to group them together in I2B2? And that wasn't even challenging. It just took somebody smarter than me to say, no, the way you did this isn't quite right. Do it like this instead. And we did it. Yes. Yes. Yes.
What sort of things are included in the patient social history?
Patient social history includes smoking. Well, if you're familiar with EHR, it's everything in the social history, but it's smoking, alcohol, tobacco use. There is, I believe, there's some information about sexual history. It doesn't include really any meaningful information about employment, economic information. Probably is something in there, but that's the basics. Yes.
Help me understand when you talk about structured data. I understand that some of those may be very easy to obtain. Let's say a lab test result that goes into potassium. You may got 20 different types of potassium, but that's the structured data. How much of that structured data needs to come from additional clicks for someone, the provider, the nurse, the physical therapist, to import versus something that is sitting in some type of cell with some characteristics?
You mean in order to get it to be available for research?
Yes, as to qualify as being structured.
Oh, what really does it mean to be structured data
Yes.
in the EHR?
Good.
It is a gray line. So certainly anything that you pick from a drop-down list is structured data. Anything that is purely a numeric value is structured data. Anything that appears to be a small field in which you have to put something is certainly structured data. The things that are part of a order or something like that characteristics of that tend to be structured data. The content of power notes, if there are places in there where you have to check yes, no, put in a particular value, that is structured data. There are things that are more open narrative text places where you can type in whatever you want. That tends to not be considered structured data. There are small fields where there is free text, and there are places in I2B2 where we pulled in a concept or a field that does have a good variety of values. And when that is the case, we can do one of two things. We can either show you all of the different things people have typed into that field and let you pick them. When it's 10 and it's heavily weighted towards the top 3 or 4, and we show you the top 3 or 4 first, that works. If it is really not consistent at all, we can let you drag the field and type in what you're looking for. That's much less common. So we can still use things that are not strictly controlled, but it is much, much more straightforward if it is the pick from a drop-down list, put in a numeric value, etc. So now, I probably should have sort of flipped this conversation, and I'm still trying to figure out, I've reorganized this, and actually show you I2B2 before I talk about all this stuff, because I think that might help the context. So I2B2 is a self-service query builder. You find concepts in what looks very much like this big hierarchy of concepts that you can drill down into, or that you can find terms that match your particular criteria. You can build queries. You can add 2, 3, 4 things into group 1, and it's any of those. So if you say any of these diagnoses and any of these diagnoses, or and none of these diagnoses, anything that you can construct in your head as Boolean logic based on facts that actually exist, you can create an I2B2 query for. You can do exclusion, so never having this, you can say that each one of these things has to be on the same encounter. So if you're interested in a lab value on the same encounter as a particular medication administration, you can constrain it that way. You can put in query constraints like numeric values between this and this. You can choose from drop-down lists when there are things like that. You can, so we can allow you to constrain however is logical for that set of values that actually exist in clinical practice. And what you get out in general is aggregate information about the population of patients that meet your criteria. The number is really the primary outcome there. We have 107 patients who meet this particular criteria. But you can also download, you can select the patient set that you just created by your I2B2 query of 107 patients. And you can say, I want all of the meds, I want all the labs, I want all of the encounter information, all the diagnoses, and you can download that data, and it looks like this. You can pull that into it natively comes out as Excel files, each of which is linked to a encounter and, I'm sorry, let me restate that. A patient list that has an identifier that is specific to your download, an encounter list that is specific with identifiers specific to your download, and all of the clinical variables that you choose. Each value is associated with an encounter and a patient. All of that is HIPAA limited data set, so it's not real medical record numbers or encounter numbers, so you can, it is acceptable to the IRB. There is a window that they allow you to use for that, so you can't let that sit there and rerun for that population for more than 2 weeks because they consider that to be following an anonymous population over time. But you can rerun the same query and you just won't get the same identifiers. But you do have a period of time where you can download as much data as you want for that particular patient set. So this is where we sort of go off script. And that's probably good timing because I really like to leave a lot of time for discussion. There are a couple of examples of how people have used I2B2 for study enrollment, for feasibility assessment, for targeting particular populations, for identifying patients for chart review so that you don't have to review all, narrowing down your population to 50, 100 instead of 2,000, 3,000 for a particular enrollment. And this information like this, the proposed enrollment section, the definition of what the population is very easy to get natively out of I2B2. And then there are people who actually do their actual research with just the data out of I2B2. It is detailed patient data. If you don't need to contact patients, it is IRB exempt. And lots of folks have done have compared lots of populations and actually done preliminary analysis and published analysis on I2B2 data. So any information you want from I2B2, just Google I2B2 UAB. It'll take you to CCTS pages that give you information about both the EDW request process, the I2B2 system, links to I2B2, what is required to log into I2B2, etc. You can't miss it. It's like the first 17 results if you Google I2B2 UAB. So I have lots and lots more slides, most of them hidden, but I'm inclined to just completely go informal now and invite questions about I2B2, about access to clinical data, about policy related to how you are allowed to get this, etc. What else do you want to know?
Would you run like a sample?
I'm going to drink my coffee.
Would you run a sample, just a generic, just to see how you lay out variables just in I2B2? Because I've played around with it and I still have no idea what I'm doing. So and I still need to go to class, but next one conflicted. So that's a ton of time on it, but just a
No
quick
problem.
example.
And I'll say I've been in multiple panels with Matt where he's just typing away and I'm like, why are you doing your email while this person's doing their panel? And then all of a sudden he's like, do you know that there's 365 patients who have X, Y, and Z, all these characteristics and markers within the system. So, you know, it's really interesting that he can pull it up just within 20 minutes of starting this panel, all of this data to be used. So I would recommend it. Go ahead with your question.
Yeah.
Is this the same thing as business objects, and is it similar to Tableau? I've worked virtually with business objects, and I've accessed the Tableau, but I've never heard of this today.
It is not. So the business objects in Tableau are more ad hoc query tools where that's allowing you to access the enterprise data warehouse directly. And there are people who are allowed to do that. This is a much lower barrier to entry than business objects. So while this is a self-service query builder and business objects is a self-service query builder, they are not at all the same. I2B2 is oriented towards people who don't know how to write SQL. Business objects, I don't use it anymore because I don't trust that I'm going to get the right answer because I don't know how to write SQL well enough anymore. I2B2 is much more user-friendly oriented. It's not going to allow you to ask a question that will break the system. So you have to be this tall to write the data warehouse. You have to be this tall to write I2B2. Okay, why is this? Why isn't this letting me, just taking me to the Blazor ID?
New security measures.
Don't want to do that.
This is good though, because other people probably did the same thing, so.
Yeah, probably so. I just logged in this morning without having to do this.
We can do it later, it's
Okay.
just a curiosity.
Yeah, so
Their big thing is that you have to do two-factor authentication.
For everything or?
All word maybe stuff. I think it kind of counts for everything. That way you don't have to log in as often. Yeah.
okay. So that's frustrating. I do like to go do real-time queries. So
I kind of have a
let's try that again.
question. Like when I've done a query before, it takes a long time sometimes. And I never knew if I had to like stay at the screen and like keep it open, or can I exit out of it and it run the query?
That is a good logistical question. So within I2B2, you can cancel the query after there's a setting that you can actually change of how long to wait. And it'll tell you, hey, this query is still running in the background. I changed that to like 10 seconds. Its default is 90 seconds. I usually just take off the 0 and put it at 9 seconds. So after 9 seconds, it'll keep running in the background, and I'll just go on to my next query. And in the and you can come back and see that query in your previous query history. So you just drag queries from this previous query history back up to the screen, and it'll show you the results. It says down there at any time whether it's still queued or processing or complete.
Do you guys have open hours or drop-in hours, or you have for clinics ever?
The open hours are more or less the I2B2 training. I2B2 training effectively these days is really just people who are using I2B2, and it is almost exclusively, I2B2 is really easy to use in terms of how the base application functions. So the training these days is pretty much what are you trying to query, and going through in real time and querying things for individual people who are there. So it is actually sort of transitioning to a more office hours orientation. We're probably going to make that more formal and just have a smaller number of office hours and less classroom oriented, and more open hours where you just sit and talk to one of the I2B2 folks. Yes.
And, we have some fellows at our partner institutions who are probably interested in the information they could get here. If they don't have a UAV login, can they contact you or I2B2 support to see about if they have a query that they want to run, but they don't have access? Is that possible?
Yes. So there will be some limitation on what information we're allowed to provide people who aren't credentialed and don't have an IRB protocol. If you're on an IRB protocol, then we would typically provide that information through the UAV personnel on the IRB protocol. But yeah, absolutely. We have folks all the time, not just from other institutions, then they'll actually send us their I2B2 query, their screenshot, and say, hey, this is what we ran at Arkansas or UMMC or in USC, and say, what do you have? And we'll run the same thing, and then there you go. Now we don't even have to do that. They can run the same query across the ACT network, and they don't have to ask us that anymore. They can see our data just as easily as they can see theirs. We have tested the process for actually using the UAV guest user accounts, the ZIAS accounts, for access to I2B2. I would like to do a couple of more policy validations before we open that up, but we do a lot of validation of education requirements to log into I2B2, making sure that you are an active person at UAB, that you are faculty or approved, and you have IRB and HIPAA training, and a acknowledgement for the appropriate use of limited data sets. So we would have to do similar things, but the ZIAS account will allow you to go into the learning management system and complete such attestations, and we can use it for authentication to I2B2. So if you have somebody like that, I could use a guinea pig that's a real life external collaborator that has one of those guest user accounts. Because I've done it myself with my Gmail account with approval from all the identity management folks. And so that is functional. The authentication is functional. We just have to figure out how we want to do the approval for people outside.
Okay. Thank you.
But to really answer your direct question, if somebody has a question and wants us to ask it for them and tell them the answer, definitely do that. That's very easy. Yes.
So I'm working on a project where we're looking to use this as a screening tool for an implementation study. So after we query I2B2 and we get a list of patients that fit our parameters, what's the next step in identifying those people and getting a list of MRNs that we can actually make contact with them?
The next step is to talk to an enterprise data warehouse analyst and say, here's my IRB protocol, here's my I2B2 query name, can you send me X, Y, and Z? If that is the encounter list, the patient demographics and contact information, and then we send that to you.
So as long as it's on an approved IRB protocol, there shouldn't be any more hiccups.
No, that is a ridiculously routine thing, and that is exactly the way we want to do it.
Awesome.
It is really easy for us if you say, here's my IRB protocol, here's my I2B2 query, can you send me this list of patients? That's the best request we get all day. If you go to this Research Commons informatics or research data request process, there's actually a request form, but you can also send something to I2B2 support email address, or you can send something to me directly or to Research Commons email address. Really, any way you want to get to anybody affiliated with the EDW and I2B2. Any other questions? I apologize for not being able to do the real demo. I guess I have to go do my two-factor authentication thing. I thought that was just for elsewhere and not for here. Okay.
What about specifics? Does anybody want to talk to Matt about specifics in your specific project afterwards too? To take the time to do that. We do have a little bit longer, but
okay. Is this scheduled till 9 or is this scheduled till
9:30?
Wow. I was thinking it was 9. So yeah, I should stand up here and do a dance or something. No, I'm definitely happy to talk about individual projects. It's pretty common as we're talking with people doing proposals, to sit there and try to figure out what patient population they're really interested in. That really is the most challenging part. And it's not challenging because of any particular system or challenging because of I2B2. It's challenging because figuring out the patients that you want from electronic health record data is challenging. Things like onset of disease. Well, there's no such thing as onset of disease. There's a date that you have a diagnosis attached to an encounter, but if we're calling that onset of disease, nobody should ever come to a healthcare delivery organization, because you get sick the day you come to a healthcare delivery organization. Things like, there are some things that are more challenging than others in terms of really figuring out your patient population. But so I usually try to advise people to cut that into tiers of screening. You first identify the population based on characteristics that are structured, consistently documented, and exist. Diagnoses, labs, meds, demographic characteristics, encounter history, etc. Then the next step may be more downloaded sets of data so that you can look at temporal characteristics, change in lab value over time, those sort of things. Then you narrow down that set of patients to a set that may really require screening in the EHR. If it takes a clinical person to look at the full context of the EHR to make a determination, then that's what is necessary. But at the very least, you can narrow down your population from 1 million plus to 1,000 to 150, and do screening on 150 instead of 1 million. And then some things for prospective clinical research and eligibility criteria just don't exist in the clinical record at all. My favorite example is one that said, is the subject willing to take 14 capsules a day for the duration of the trial? Nobody in clinical practice has ever asked anyone, are you willing to take 14 capsules a day? Nobody has, and nobody will ever ask that question. You have to sit in front of the potential research participant and do the screening visit to know that question, or know that answer. But you can tier those things. So it's not just one mammoth find my patients. It is going through an iterative process in the most efficient way possible at every step to narrow down your population. You were asking a question.
Well, I was just going to say, if you don't want to stick around, do you want to talk about your research just for a second? Like, everyone introduce yourselves real quick, just so that when you call Matt, they'll at least be able to put a name in the case, maybe. You want to start, Emily? I mean,
Sure. I'm Emily Levitan. I'm an epidemiologist and mostly study heart failure. So I have used I2B2 for my grant to say that we have, if I want to recruit 60 people with heart failure, we've got 9,000 hospitalizations a year.
I'm Frank Gleason. I'm a general surgery resident. I'm one of the VA Quality Scholar Fellows. And I'm mainly doing outcomes research and QI. I have 2 projects I want to talk about.
Okay. I'm Colin. I'm a pharmacist, also in the VA Quality Scholars Fellowship. A lot of my research is in the oncology department, looking at infusion wait times. But I did have a question. So under the medications section, did we look up, like, see how many patients had an event while on a certain medication, or is it just they had a medication at some point and they also had this event at some point?
What do you mean by event, and how is that documented?
Say I want to know, did a patient have a positive flu test while on diltiazem?
So yes, for the medication information, and for medication orders that have or that you can assume a duration as while on. It's one of those things that there's no, we can say individual instances of medication prescriptions and
Not like how long they were active for.
You have to sort of presume that they were active or not that's a decision for every person who's looking at that data. If you see consistent prescriptions over time, you can probably safely assume that they're on it. If you see a 4-month supply and then a 6 months later you have another 4-month supply, whether you consider that to be continuous on the medication is very, very fuzzy. But that's just me putting in all my caveats. You can certainly see date timestamps related to all events and the including medication and anything that we've pulled into I2B2 in terms of those events. So things like immunizations is one of the things that's that is included both as medications and as separate immunization indications. So for those sorts of things, yeah, that's pretty straightforward to get the data in order to do that analysis and figure out what you think that means. And medications is specifically like that, because I mean, whether somebody is on a medication when they are not physically here is a judgment call. And that's not just us, that's everywhere.
I'm Tim. I'm a research fellow with the orthopedics department. This would mainly be for screening patients for our clinical trials.
And I'm Haley. I'm also a research fellow in the orthopedics department, so very similar to Tim.
I'm A.B. Gilbert, I'm a statistician in hematology oncology. Besides the implementations that we're going to do, I've used this to identify some TCIS patients with recurrent breast cancer, as well as we used it to match some demographic information from a group of patients who completed a patient-reported outcomes survey. So I had some dabbling with ITB2.
Patient-reported outcomes is one of the other things that we're actively looking at adding to ITB2. So there are particularly with the infectious disease 1917 folks, they have a patient-reported outcomes system that is used beyond just ID, and we're working with them actively to incorporate patient-reported outcomes in ITB2. And the way that would look is basically by organized probably by instrument with all of the individual questions indicated as well as the calculated score indicated as facts related to an individual patient. That's great.
I'm John Merchant. I help manage pre and postdoctoral awards like the TL1, TL2, and T32. And I'm really glad to know more about this. I'd love to be able to present it to fellows when they first start so they know that it's here as they craft their research plan.
It is a immediate access to data, and in my experience, finding your data set is a pretty good chunk of brain power at the beginning of a training process.
My name's Sandy. I'm a second year T32 postdoc fellow. My area is in looking at the impact of palliative care in end-stage liver disease population. And I did basically use this when I was planning a retrospective study, and it was great because not having to go through all the IRB stuff, I was able to look up, what percent of the end-stage liver disease population got a palliative care consult. And it actually saved me a lot of time because I realized, I got a number and I realized it was actually not that different from already published literature, and it sort of saved me a whole thing to, a lot of time that could have been wasted if I had to go through IRB and do all that. So it's a great tool.
Well, I'm glad that was a positive spin and not a, wow, this told me what I thought I would wanted to do is not the thing I want to do. Cost avoidance is still positive.
I'm Lucia Juarez. I'm a statistician and physician of preventive medicine, and I do some research with cardiovascular and diabetes. And I have a question about the records in I2B2. So you mentioned that this database keeps on growing and keeps on updating. So once you get your query done, is there any chance that any of the information on those records is going to be updated or changed somehow?
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, it is every night the electronic health record populates the enterprise data warehouse. So every night there are new patients, new encounters, new events associated with an existing encounter, et cetera. We load I2B2 from that periodically, every 2 weeks, give or take. And so if you run the same query 2 weeks later after a load, you may have an additional patient that qualifies. If you identify a population of 100 patients and download their labs, meds, diagnoses, and from I2B2, and if you run the same query or even download data for the same population, if it's within that 2 weeks, but after a load, you may have additional medications if there is additional information in the EHR. So yeah, it is not a static data set. It is going to be a continually growing as close to a representation of the actual patient population at UAB, updated regularly.
Hi, I'm Sam Baker. I'm one of the surgery residents. VA Club, short. VA Club, I'll stand up. And I haven't personally accessed I2B2, but one of our colleagues in our group, we use it to look at the implementation of a health literacy screener in our colorectal surgery clinic. So every week we get a report of how many we've generated, what their scores were.
Okay. Nice. That doesn't even sound familiar to me, but I'm glad you're getting data.
It's a note that's been labeled a certain way, so we've been asked that they pull that note for us and we're making the scores out of it.
Okay.
Fabrice Julian, I'm a pre-doctoral fellow in medical sociology here, and I haven't used I2B2, but prior to coming to UAB, my work dealt with onboarding all the New Hampshire public hospitals to the meaningful use system. So I have a lot of background in EHR data. Haven't been able to tap into that in a while. So really interested in kind of getting back into this.
I'm Sarah Rutland. I'm also a pre-doctoral scholar in the medical sociology program here. I'm at healthcare needs in younger populations, and I'm not familiar with EHR data looking through it. So for example, if someone's presenting to the emergency department, can you look to see the source of their visit? So like physical trauma, car accident versus, sports injury versus, or is it can you actually get that specific with the source of why someone has presented?
The way data is structured within UAB for encounters is that there is a reason for visit.
Okay.
It is free text reason for visit. We do, in addition to I2B2, we actually have a population screening tool that really is more of a population detection that includes a natural language processing pipeline. And so we use that reason for visit to look for things like COPD, shortness of breath, those sorts of things. So it's not in I2B2 because the reason for visit is ridiculously unstructured. But it is available for, that's a pretty easy thing and a very known thing. If you identify a population of patients with an encounter in the emergency department in a particular time frame, and then want to get the reason for visit for all of them, and you can look at them yourselves, or that you can do sort of rudimentary text search. We can do that rudimentary text search. It's not going to be a detailed natural language processing with negation and concept identification and extraction and all of that, but it is usually a short reason for visit.
Okay.
And so for an analyst to interrogate that reason for visit for you is pretty easy. Not in I2B2 though.
If I
I'll just email you.
just kind of reiterate what you said, we've done something similar to that, and I mean, you guys are extremely helpful in getting us the information we need, because we were trying to calculate hospitalization rates following a suppression screener, and we were wanting to know like ED visits, inpatient stays, and all that, and what were the diagnoses and chief complaints. Like you said, they're unstructured, but I mean, it requires a little extra work. I mean, you can definitely do it. Like, we've done it.
Okay.
He needs to come to all the presentations.
Your hype man.
Yeah. You need 5% effort to be a hype man.
Yeah.
I'm Jamie Armbruster. I'm interested in patients with chronic kidney disease and their outcomes.
kind of rural urban differences and their access to pharmaceuticals. So I'm very interested in trying to explore this one.
So a couple of the geographic characteristics. I mean, so you can certainly look for patients by county, by city, et cetera. We have the GIS related information now. We also have pretty rudimentary rural versus urban counties. That's not particularly helpful in Alabama necessarily, but there's also information about medically underserved areas, medically underserved populations incorporated into our phenotype library, which is sort of a catch-all if we identify a population or geographically oriented or spatially oriented data. So there is some of that information in there.
Do you think that that's also available through the other partner institutions where we can view just to make comparisons?
That is definitely one of the things that is not your standard typical implementation of I2B2. The standard typical implementation is visits, patients, labs, meds, diagnoses, and procedures. That's it. That's it. The vast majority of folks who use I2B2 or a comparable system around the country are doing those things. So the short answer is probably not immediately, but if you have an interested party at another institution, there's always opportunity for us to show them how we did it, point them towards the resources that are publicly available that we use to do it, and help them take advantage of that opportunity.
My name is Jacqueline Lambert Davidson, being on Scotland or Scotland. And I guess my question is, do you think you would ever include behavior science? I look more at the nurse or rather than the patient.
Okay. So we have had a couple of projects, and to repeat the question, it's a question about whether we would anticipate including information to support, I would call it process-oriented research, staffing, personnel behavior, patterns of practice, those sorts of things. The short answer for within I2B2, that may be challenging because it is extremely patient-oriented. But we've actually done projects related to that before, looking at not just the clinical data. You can identify patterns of practice based on the artifact of that practice. So order, date, time stamps, time in individual patient records to see patterns of nursing practice. But also comparing that to, there are other information sources within the health system and the EDW to look at those patterns and that departmentally oriented, staff-oriented organization. So we've done that. It's not necessarily I2B2, but it's definitely an area of research that we've supported and provided information about that is oriented towards unit, staff, etc. Yes.
Is payer included in I2B2?
Payer specifically is not included. The payer type is included. So commercial insurance, self-pay, those sort of things. The payer information has not really been a high priority, but we do have access to payer information at the encounter level that is we use for projects all the time, just not within I2B2.
I have a question. How far back do these data go? Was it retroactively added after the EHR was implemented, or can you speak on that at all? Go ahead.
The short answer is more or less 2010 and forward, because that was the inpatient implementation of the EHR. So the longer answer is it sort of depends on what area of information and how much during that EHR implementation was pulled in. So legacy labs, diagnoses, procedures, those sorts of things. Some things may go back farther than others, depending on when they were actually documented in clinical practice. So we have the original implementation of the Cerner EHR really pre-impact was emergency department, lab, radiology, and surgery. So that information goes back a little bit farther than the inpatient-oriented things.
And then second question is, have you guys done any work curating some of the unstructured fields, like curating those data? Like, do you guys plan to, anything like that in the future?
That is a
I know it's a
question about about curating some of that unstructured data. That's an interesting question. As a matter of philosophy, I tend to tell people when they ask me, is it right? I say it matches the EHR explicitly, and we don't change anything. We strictly just bring in data as it exists and don't try to modify it in any way. It is what it is. And that analysis being individual project oriented. That said, we could add additional information. So not curating as in mapping these 50 descriptions to a single thing and then replacing those 50 descriptions, but adding some additional structure so that we can do grouping, that we can do not in replacing individual things, but doing additional concept abstraction out of that. And things like the full text document. It is definitely in the pipeline to do a base set of concept annotation on clinical documents. So you would have the full text of the clinical documents, but you would also have structured data around individual concepts that were mentioned in that document so that you could use those individual concepts as structured data in addition to just being able to use the full text of the document.
Should we ask the folks online if they want to? I know we have some scholars on there. Just
Anybody online want to ask questions? Hearing none. One thing that is not really directly related to the sort of average normal use of I2B2 is that we want, there's a context in which I2B2 can be used in a more fully identified way and include an individual's research data. So example is somebody working in precision oncology, Eddie Yang, he has data from external sources. We load his data from external sources into a separate instance of I2B2, and he can see his concepts and all of the other concepts in I2B2. Other investigators, Lou Bridges, can see their concepts, and Eddie can't see Lou's, and Lou can't see Eddie's, and they're both in the same place. You can use the I2B2 concepts that exist for everybody to construct queries, but you can also use your own structured data that has come from your individual research to constrain populations at the same time and get data sets out that are a combination of your own research data and all of the other EHR data on the same patients. And we've pulled data from Encore, Clinical Trials Management System, where there are case report forms documented. We've pulled it from REDCap, and we've pulled it from Excel spreadsheets and other random data structures and pulled that population of data into I2B2 as a data store. So if you have data that you want to sort of systemically combine with EHR data, that is something I very much want to support also, because it's, in my mind, there's no reason to do your analysis in a completely separate and disconnected way. We can help you combine all of that data, integrate the research collected data and the clinical data on your populations, and give you that data for in a combined way for analysis.
You still wouldn't have to have an IRB for that.
That is in the context of if you are collecting data you have an IRB protocol. So this is for in the context of your own IRB approved prospective data collection. But there wouldn't be any additional IRB protocol needed for us to include your IRB data into this data structure for us to give it back to you.
Great. Well, I know some people want to have some time to talk about, so I think we'll conclude today, but thank you very much for coming next week.